Friday, December 1st, and this is the beginning of Season 2 of Mind Body Evolution. Hi, Josh.
Hello, Eric. I'm very excited about this. Moving forward, we took a week off for Thanksgiving. I'm going to be trying to work without notes this week because I have been putting together some grants, which I'm really excited about with the Life Worth Living project. We'll see if that works out.
That is very exciting.
Very exciting. I've got a whole bunch of different projects happening. I'm getting my research class together, so we'll find out about that. I can give you some updates about that probably in season 3. It's going to take some time. But today I want to talk about a ecological theory that is, well known in academic circles, but not really outside of it. It's called R versus K. Sounds kind of obscure, but it actually explains how basically spoiling our children is going to save the world. And how we are driven to do things that seem to not necessarily be good for us or our children, but it is actually part of a larger force that evolution has dictated for us. The sort of ecological relationships have dictated for us. It's a lot like economics. Economics has a particular drive to it, and you can come up with equations that describe how things work in economics. But then once you understand it, you can see how everything else is pushed by it, and it's not something you decide. It's just sort of a force of nature.
A thing that happens.
A thing that happens. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So R versus K.
R versus K. Exactly. So the R part is reproduction, and so organisms compete to produce the most babies. That's the nature of evolution. And so one way to win the evolution game is producing more babies. And so that's the R competition. So if you're an organism that wants to produce babies, you have babies very early, you have lots of them, they're small, and you don't give a lot of care to them because they have to be off and making their own babies as soon as possible. So things that are what we call R selected are things like mice, Cockroaches, things that reproduce very, very quickly, have zero parental care. They tend to be small, short-lived, and have small brains. So that's sort of the essence of what R selection is.
Why is that R for reproduction?
For reproduction, R, literally for reproduction. And then the other side of it is K selection. K, because of whatever reasons, the people who were first working on this were Germans. They came up with K for carrying capacity.
Okay.
It's just one of those things, yeah.
As in
the K means carrying.
But what is carrying capacity?
Okay, yeah, we're about to talk about that. Okay, yeah, so carrying capacity is the limits of a particular environment. So if you're an organism and you need to live in a hole, how many holes are there to live in? That's the carrying capacity of a particular environment. How much food is the environment is in the environment? Are you going to be able to support your offspring?
So in other words, what population can the environment support?
Right, and that would be theoretically a given number, so that you can't really exceed that amount. And so if you're an organism living at carrying capacity, you're working very differently from one that is trying to compete at reproductive rate. So reproductive rate is when there's few limiting resources. You're just trying to push out babies as fast as you possibly can, and those babies are going to be pushing out their babies as fast as they can, etc. But as the numbers build up, you start to reach a maximum level. In that kind of world, when there is some sort of limiting factor, usually whoever is biggest and strongest wins, not the one with the most babies. So if you think of something like an elephant has very few natural predators. They have the limits of their own habitat are limiting their population. They have little slowing them down. Of course, obviously, modern humans have slowed elephants down greatly. But before us, elephants really had nothing that they had to worry about. They had very large babies that they would give a lot of parental care to. They would teach them where to go, where to find the foods, and they would protect those babies. So those babies had a very good chance of surviving. And when they did, they would become a huge animal that had nothing that could threaten them. And so what they want to do is they want to make the biggest possible baby. And if you want to make the biggest possible baby, you don't have lots of babies. You have one baby at a time. Mm-hmm. And you make it really, really big. And the biggest baby is going to be the biggest elephant and is going to win the elephant game and make new big babies. And so this is competing at carrying capacity. So it's very, very different. It's almost the opposite of competing for reproduction. So you have babies later in your life after you've built up resources and you have more experience. You put all of your resources into your baby to make them as big as possible so they can grow up to be the biggest possible elephant. You tend to be long-lived because it takes a while to make a baby, and if you're going to make more than one, it's going to take a really long time. You have very long gestation periods so that the baby's developing for a really long time, and then when it's born, you have further care after that. So a lot of parental care, a lot of communal care. It's not just one female elephant with a baby elephant, it's the entire community working together.
The R creatures are born running, and the K creatures need years of
years
care.
And years of care, exactly. And this care has a real value because as the elephant develops, it learns its culture, and its culture tells them where the water is, tells them where to go at a particular time, and they're able to travel around their habitat and understand it in a way that if they hadn't been taught, they wouldn't know. Many of these societies tend to have a longer-lived matriarch that is the sort of repository of knowledge. This goes for pretty much all of the more intelligent species out there, like whales and elephants. They tend to have a group led by an older female who has the sort of knowledge of the group and tells people where to go and what to do. You know, not people, elephants. But the idea is that the knowledge itself is part of the ecological adaptation. That this knowledge contained in the community, in the culture, is vital to raising this young elephant. And by keeping this knowledge in the group, the young elephant has a much higher chance of success and will be a bigger elephant that then makes more bigger elephants. And so this is a evolutionary strategy as opposed to R selection that maximizes things in a totally different direction. Big brains, large body, long-lived, lots of parental care. So obviously, humans are lying in this realm. We are not mice, we are much more like elephants. And this is true of mammals in general. If you compare, say, mammals to insects, mammals in general tend to have more infant care. We nurse our babies. It's one of our defining characteristics. We tend to work in social groups. Insects can as well, but it's very, very different. And so this is a defining characteristic of our entire group in general. But then when you get into primates, it becomes stronger. So primates tend to have more parental care and fewer babies than other comparative-sized animals. And they tend to be a little bit smarter. So they have slightly larger brains. They're spending more time training their young where to find food. And they are basically competing with other members of their own species. Usually primates are going to have within species competition. There's also between species competition, but a lot of it is going to be within species. They tended to get larger body sizes. So lemurs in general are a little bit smaller than monkeys. Monkeys in general are a little bit smaller than apes. So obviously there's exceptions to this. There's tiny monkeys and there's bigger lemurs. But as you look at the entire sort of graph of body size and sort of evolutionary development.
As you look at the graph of body size of humans in the modern era, we've gotten bigger, haven't we?
We can talk about that.
Okay.
That's a separate issue.
Don't mean to jump ahead.
Yeah. So in general, we've been moving in this direction. Longer lives, larger body size, bigger brains, more parental care, and more competing at carrying capacity. So you can see that monkeys are smarter than lemurs, and they have a longer parental care period. Apes are smarter than monkeys, and they have an even longer parental care period. Within this group, except for gorillas, we're really the largest in them. Humans are. The only thing larger than us would be, a silverback gorilla, which are huge. But they're also our closest relatives, so they're definitely the direction we've been moving in for some time. Once you get up to something like a silverback gorilla, you really have eliminated almost all of the predators that can compete with you.
That's the elephant of this.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about guarding mates and making sure you're the one to reproduce. If you're a female silverback, you want, not silverback. If you're a female gorilla, you want to make really big babies so one of them can grow up to be the dominant silverback and have all the reproductive success. And so it becomes even more important because it's somewhat of a winner take all. If your male baby doesn't win this contest to be the big silverback with a harem, he's going to have zero reproductive success. Because he'll never have a reproductive opportunity, whereas a silverback that has a harem of females has all of the reproductive abilities. So there's even more pressure to produce really large babies that are going to win these competitions. With humans, we ended up in a similar sort of situation. So we left the jungle, we became upright apes on the Serengeti, and our brains grew maybe a little tiny bit. We probably were needing a little bit more tool use because we had to dig up tubers. It's really hard to dig with your hand, but if you have a stick, you can dig something up. So I'm not saying we were intelligent yet as we were going on the Serengeti, but we're needing some of the aspects of intelligence. So we could dig up a tuber with a stick, we could crack a nut with a rock, some very, very simple tool use, the kind of things that you would expect a chimpanzee to be able to do if it's, say, we're a biped with hands that it could hold things with a little bit better and be out on the Serengeti. But still, mostly chimpanzee hands, mostly chimpanzee brain, but just sort of a biped that needs a little bit more than what chimpanzees needed because they need to know where things are. It's harder to find a tuber underground than it is to see a fruit growing in a tree. So knowledge would have been useful to pass on to future generations. So we could imagine that these early Australopithecines would have lived in family groups. An isolated female Australopithecine with a young child would not have been able to survive on her own. So we could imagine that this would have built a community, much like the whales and the elephants. They probably had some older female, which knew where things were. And that would have been guiding the organization with a sort of cultural memory of where foods were, where the rains come, that kind of thing, dates, times, places. When we make the transition to genus Homo, when our brains roughly double in size, we become even more dependent. So when an infant is born, we can't make our brains big enough to be as intelligent as we are today. That's sort of a confusing way to put it, but an infant must be born with a brain small enough to get out of the birth canal of a biped. If you spread the hips any wider, the biped waddles side to side. Pregnant women have problems with moving side to side as they walk anyway because their hips are spreading, and this is slowing them down. It's making them less efficient. Any further spreading of the hips would be even more inefficient. So bipeds are strictly restricted to the size of the birth canal, which restricts the size of the brain. So we maximize the size of a brain of a baby that can be born, and then we end up with essentially a 21-month gestation period. So we have the first 9 months in the womb, and then we continue after that for about another year of the brain growing. And so this is...
So the skull plates are not fused.
The skull plates are not fused. The neurons are dividing rapidly. The brain is growing really rapidly. And so these infants are even more dependent than any other primate has ever been. So primates in general are smart with big brains and dependent infants, but now we've entered a whole new range of dependency. So we're K-selected, but on another level that other things really haven't been in terms of our dependent offspring. We take so much effort to raise our young.
And this happened during the transition to the Serengeti?
The Serengeti was really just us becoming upright apes. This was the transition to us getting big brains, our genus. So Serengeti was about 6 million years ago. Yeah, so our genus is about 2 million years ago. Okay, so now we have not just sticks and stones that we use to dig something up with, but we have stones that are purposely shaped. They have sharp edges, they take chips, and they require a little bit more work. They require a plan ahead of time.
So this was well after we got access to the marrow, when you were talking about...
This is that moment.
This is that moment.
This is that moment. Australopithecines probably were doing some scavenging. They would have been able to maybe scare off some predators by doing some throwing, but now we're at a whole nother level. Australopithecines would not have had a shoulder that could throw very well, just like chimps can't do that.
Mm.
Homo erectus has an even better body for, say, running, but specifically it has adaptations to the shoulders that allow throwing.
So we've reached a point where we have actually been selected for better bodies for throwing and running.
Right. And in terms of our brains, up until now, keeping a small brain worked really well with being a biped, because you could easily give birth. But now you've reached something else. We've reached a period where our abilities are requiring large brains to make these sophisticated tools, to do the kind of planning and throwing and targeting that I think we need to do as Homo erectus, needs a really, really big brain. And so once we start producing these big brained offspring, we require even more parental care. We require more sharing within a group. So the groups are forming a sort of higher level culture where individuals can no longer survive on their own. Even small family groups cannot survive on their own. They must be interacting with others. Interestingly, you see the sexual dimorphism between males and females reducing during this period. So Australopithecines are more like a silverback gorilla. The males are almost twice as big as the females, but by the time you get to Homo erectus, the males are only about 20% bigger than the females. It's closer to a chimpanzee kind of size disparity. So there's still male-male competition, but it's within a larger group. So the same way chimpanzees are all working within a larger group, and because of that can have a much larger troop than, say, silverback gorillas. So silverback gorillas might have 20 in an entire group, whereas a chimpanzee could have 80 or 90 with an entire group because they have many males working together. The same thing would have been happening with Homo erectus. So once males are now cooperating, they don't need to have one that's twice the size of everyone else. They're now much closer in size to the females. Probably tools have something to do with this. If you've got a rock in your hand, it doesn't help you that much to be twice the size of the other guy. So size doesn't matter as much. Our teeth get smaller, our sexual dimorphism shrinks at the same time as our brain is doubling in size. This would have been very, very difficult for women going through childbirth, because now essentially the brain and birth canal are the same size, or the brain's actually slightly larger. So the hips have to shift to give birth. The brain has to be squeezed to actually come out. It actually has to fold the hinges in the skull. So these are very dependent offspring now. But during this dependent period, now is arriving another level of culture. So these stone tools can be taught to the next generation. You can learn to do these things that get you more food. So now, instead of just a crushing rock that you maybe could pound through a bone through to get the bone marrow, now we have slicing and crushing rocks. So we can cut through a hide that no other animal on the Serengeti can get through. So we can slice in, we can get to the meat, and we can use basically cleaver-shaped rocks to break the biggest bones, so that we can actually smash into a full-size elephant bone and get the marrow out of there. So these are new resources combined with new costs, tremendously dependent offspring, requiring sharing, requiring people to work together.
This is like a precursor to the farming trap. Like we get these new resources, but they create new dependencies.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is something that happens over and over again. As soon as you maximize something, you reach the limitations of that thing. And so we maximize our brains, and we've reached the limitations of what big brains can do. We can't make our brains any bigger and still give birth. It's just impossible. And so we've reached this kind of maximum situation. And what we do is the development happens outside the womb, and much of the development has now become the development of culture, not a physiological development. We have knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation that makes us who we are outside of our physiology. It's not programmed in the way it would be programmed in. Well, a mouse doesn't have to be taught to do anything. It just knows what to do. Whereas a baby needs to be told every single thing.
Every single thing.
Every single thing. And so this has been programmed into us as humans for the last 2 million years since we got big brains. Taking care of our kids has been essentially a number one priority as individuals and as communities. If a community doesn't come together to have kids, it won't have kids because it's necessary. If you're a man and a woman raising a baby, I'm sorry, these are gendered binaries, but this is biology. I tend to talk this way. If you're a man and a woman having a baby and you have to take care of that baby, you're not going to get the calories needed to bring up the baby, let alone, keep yourself alive. So you need to be part of a larger group. And everyone needs this. There are periods of time where we all need to work together to actually produce infants. Otherwise, they just will starve. And a hunter-gatherer female can produce enough calories to keep herself alive with maybe a tiny bit of surplus, but working with a mate, she can get enough to actually keep her toddlers alive and maybe get pregnant with another infant. And what if her mate doesn't actually find meat that day? Other people in the group will be able to bring them meat. Now, I do have a tendency to tell these narratives that could reinforce certain sexist stereotypes of the female staying at home with the babies and the male hunters going out and getting food. This is something that is seen in hunter-gatherer societies, but they've only recently started looking at the literature and realizing that basically every time women are out getting food, they call it gathering, and anytime men are out getting food, they call it hunting. And it turns out that they're actually, in many ways, working in the same projects. So one of the best ways to hunt is you have a whole bunch of people driving animals towards a hunter waiting with a spear. That's also the younger males, and the females can be doing this driving, whereas a large male who's stronger might be able to drive that spear home. These are facts of biology. I'm not trying to tell a gendered story, but you would imagine that if you sort of take a slightly larger view, the idea of only men do hunting, I think, is false. That women are participating in the hunting, women are participating in all of the calorie acquisition. There's a few things that simply being stronger as a man probably have some advantages. The part where you're running to that dead animal and then trying to defend it and bring back the food, that was probably mostly men, but you can certainly see cultures where women would participate in this sort of thing. And there's been many times when, for example, in the animal world, men become too muscle-bound to do the running. So, for example, the female lions do all the hunting. The male lions don't do the hunting. Every once in a while, there's a situation where female lions will chase a buffalo towards a male lion who's big and strong enough to bring that buffalo down. But it's the women who actually do predominantly the hunting. So we could look at these stories from that point of view. We could see that the women are actually doing most of the calorie acquisition, and every once in a while, men are coming back with a large supply of meat. So there's different ways you can look at that same story.
Somehow that sounds familiar.
Yeah. So there's different ways you can look at that same story, but we have tended to look at it from a totally male point of view, and I think that's
fancy that.
I think that's a mistake. Yeah. And this is something that we've only recently started looking at. Again, papers were coming out in 2017 talking about how we need to reevaluate this analysis of hunter-gatherers. All right, so anyway, we've got this idea of a community raising offspring, and that a lot of what the community is doing is providing culture, which allows the community to keep going and acquire more calories for its offspring. And so this is a necessary part of being human right from the very beginning of having a large brain. So sort of let's fast forward through our cultures. You get to a farming culture, and suddenly it's really advantageous to have more children. In a farming community, the more children you have working the fields, the more calories you're bringing in. And so farming families tend to maximize the number of children and experience famines. Every time it doesn't rain or there's a flood, there's problems with it. And so what happens when we get farming communities? We shrink. Our bodies get smaller. Our brains get smaller. And so for the last 10,000 years or so, our brains were actually smaller than they were as hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic, and our bodies shrank. So we became smaller, our brains became smaller, and we started having more children. And so this is where we've been for sort of the last 10,000 years. Children were certainly not expendable, but it was a natural part of life living in large communities that you would write off a couple to disease. And so very often you'd lose children before the age of 5 to these communicable diseases that existed because of farming. If you lived in a hunter-gatherer society, you didn't have plagues running through your city because you didn't have a city. Whereas if you're all sort of the huddled masses all living together in a city and you're doing your farming, you want as many babies as you can to raise your crops and harvest your crops, and you're going to lose some to diseases rolling through. And so this is just sort of the way we've been living for the last 10,000 years or so. This didn't change much in the Industrial Revolution. People often think of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution as essentially a rise of these farmers moving to the city, and suddenly the city is becoming technological, and the farmers are sort of swelling the populations of the city. But it turns out that much of the Industrial Revolution, for example, London, was a population sink. That people would move from the countryside, move to London, and if you were poor in London in the 18th century, you were going to die of disease pretty early. And that a large portion of the actual offspring being born were offspring of the upper classes one way or another. They were having babies with their maids or with prostitutes.
But you're saying the lower classes were just dying.
They were not a population. They were not a growing population for the most part. The population was growing outside of the cities as we were getting better farming practices. We had mills that could grind the flour better. We had more transportation. As people were getting better food outside the cities and still having large numbers of babies, the population would rise outside the city. They'd move to the city to make money, and then they would die of cholera. And so, yeah, so this was what we built for ourselves in the Industrial Revolution. And as this ended, as we were transitioning to a sort of post-industrial world, we figured out medicine, we figured out flush toilets and sanitation, and we started turning our cities into places where populations were actually growing as opposed to population sinks. And so it became reasonable to expect your babies to not die in the first couple of years. And as this is happening, we start discovering that to do well in the world, it helps for your children to perhaps get a higher education. And so we start competing for, instead of how many babies can I turn out to make myself more food on my farm, we start competing for whose babies can succeed the best in this sort of post-industrial society where everything is decided by who got to the best university, who got to the best high school, who got to the best junior high school, etc.
So now it's about technology, even if that technology is reading and writing.
That technology is reading and writing, it's already built into our species, right? We know we need culture to support our babies. We know we need passing knowledge on to the next generation. This has been done right from the very beginning, but suddenly instead of just the number of hands you have working the fields, it's all about culture, and it's all about who has the most knowledge, and it's all about who can win the game based on who has the most resources put into their offspring to develop the most culture, essentially. And so we start to transition to a world where we're having fewer babies because they're no longer on the farm. Those babies are surviving because we've defeated cholera by having flush toilets. And we now are seeing the families that have fewer babies doing better than the families that have too many babies. Babies have now become a cost, a resource cost, and we start thinking as rational beings about maybe I don't want to have as many babies because I need to put more resources into them if they're going to end up going to college. And so you end up with a situation where rationally people are needing more and more resources to raise a child. At the same time as this is happening, we get birth control, and we end up deciding that women can also have jobs as well as men. So now you need two parents working together, much like the hunter-gatherers did, to produce enough resources. I won't say calories at this point. Calories we have in abundance, but it's a different kind of resources. It's money, but it's also knowledge resources. And you need both parents working together to produce this. Single parents have a harder time. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And it becomes very, very difficult for a child without parents to succeed in any way. So you're going to be producing fewer offspring that you put more resources into, and you work together as two parents.
Sometimes I put Reese's in them also.
Putting more and more resources into fewer children, and so this is a rational strategy that we've developed, where we realize that we live in an expensive world. Where we're competing for a limited number of resources, and that we're essentially at carrying capacity. There is no one's building more and more and more universities that all need lots and lots of people in them. These are limited slots, and if you get into a better university, you have a better chance of succeeding later in life than if you get into a place that isn't a university, or you go into a place where you're not as successful. Now, I'm mostly talking about sort of one path to success. There's obviously other ways to succeed in the world, but all of these require a lot of resources and a lot of culture and a lot of support from parents. So we are purposely limiting the number of children we're having, because that way we can pay for their tuitions or their training or the schooling they're going to need.
That way we hope we will have enough resources to do what is necessary.
And if you have, say, 6 children, this is much, much more difficult than if you have 1 or 2. And so across the world, we are seeing essentially a demographic collapse. Back in the 1970s, we were talking about the population bomb. We were going to explode in a sort of neo-Malthusian collapse of the world as we burned through all our resources, poisoned the environment around us. This was happening. We really were going through that neo-Malthusian growth. It was a logarithmic curve. It was going up, almost straight up, until about a decade or two ago, and now it's leveled off. And it's leveled off because we are having fewer children really across the world. And it's starting to approach a point where we're about to enter a demographic collapse. So you need 2 children to replace the 2 parents. So if you have 2 parents, 2 children equals the 2 parents. Generally, you want about 2.1, 2.2 children, because sometimes someone dies in the process. So on an average, as a culture, you need about 2.1, 2.2 to replace the parents. We're now at a point where many countries are well below 2.
Japan, famously, yeah.
Korea just hit 0.8.
Really?
Yeah, so 0.8. So think about that. That means less than half of the people in this generation are going to be in the next generation.
Thanos is getting what he wanted.
Exactly, yeah. So this could be great for the environment, but it's going to cause all sorts of problems for us economically. And it's because capitalism is built on constant growth. And so we in many ways, I think we're adjusting our economies so that it feels like we're still living in a time when there's not enough slots for everyone, where we're constantly adjusting to where we're at maximum capacity for growth at all times. So our universities only have a certain number of slots. If they get more students, they'll hire a professor. But if there's not enough students, they'll fire a professor. So there's always just not quite enough classes for the students to be in.
Which is why there's always a line at the supermarket.
It's why there's always a line at the supermarket, why there's always a line, they overbook the airplane tickets, everything. So everything about capitalism is designed to get you at that sort of maximum and a little bit beyond maximum.
Just at 101, 102%.
Exactly. So everything is just a little bit stressed. But this means that we're constantly feeling like we have a few too many people. And so we're adjusting our population down because of that. In a rational manner, as individuals, we're having fewer babies. We're deciding we don't have a big enough house. We don't have enough income coming in. How am I going to send these kids to school? All of these things. We say, well, I'm going to stop at 1 or 2, and that's enough. Because we don't have a lot of options. If we had more babies, the whole family would be poor and not succeed. And it would be very, very difficult. It's not impossible, but it would be much, much more difficult. And so these are rational choices we are making. And so I wanted to relate this to both saving the world and us spoiling our children. That's what I was sort of mentioning at the beginning. So what happens when you have fewer children? One, you put more resources into them. Now, some of these are rational resources. You know, I discovered when my first child was being going up and trying to get into schools that she couldn't get into the grammar school of her choice because she didn't have enough of a resume at the age of 5. And so I realized that I needed to start putting these kids in programs, getting them documented their activities so that they could get into the high school they needed to get into, so that they could then get into the right college they needed to get into. I needed to start scheduling their lives. So the stuff we talk about where we overschedule our kids' lives is necessary. If you don't do it, bad things will happen. You can't just let your kids go free range on the street because then I won't have documentation that they learned a skill.
It doesn't feel right.
And that's one side of it. So we're constantly over supervising and over scheduling our children. The next thing is we're worried about them. Now that we have fewer children and they're not dying at the age of 5 or before the age of 5, we're constantly watching them and making sure we have covers on the outlets and making sure that babies are not falling in the well and all these kind of things.
Because we're not having 6 kids.
Because we're not having 6 kids. It's not that the people who had 6 kids didn't love their babies, but now when you only have 1 or 2 of them, it's absolutely rational to spend all of your time watching them to make sure they're okay.
And if you had 6 babies, did you have time to cover the outlets?
Didn't have time for any of this stuff. Exactly. It wasn't that we didn't love our children in previous generations. It's just that we didn't have the time and resources to give all of our time and resources to them.
Some of the previous generations might not have loved their kids, but yes,
well, we've certainly changed things a lot.
Yes.
You know, the what appears to us today as negligent only 30 years ago, for example, or 40 years ago, was completely normal.
Was normal.
Right. And now older generations look at us and say, why are you spoiling your kids so much? And this is something that is absolutely predicted by evolutionary theory, that when you have fewer kids, you're going to be spending way more energy on them, spend more time looking at them, more time with them, and you're going to like it. We enjoy spending time with our children because evolution has programmed us to. Animals that didn't produce children very well. And so anytime you have extra resources, you're going to want to give it to your kids. Anytime you have extra time, you're going to want to give it to your kids. People with 1 kid
You're saying this is evolutionarily driven.
This is evolutionary driven. If you have 1 child, you're not going to give it. You're not going to have twice the time as if you had 2 children. You're going to have maybe a tiny bit extra time than if you had 2 children, because you're going to take all that time, you're going to put it into your 1 kid, because that is where all your evolutionary eggs are. That's your 1 basket. And so everything you're going to do is going to be, you're going to do, trying to mitigate risks. You're going to try and give them as much opportunities as you can. You're going to give them as many skills that they can put on a piece of paper for a resume.
In other words, you're not going to say, go and play on the street,
You're not going to say, go and play on the street, kid. And so the exact same things that we are now complaining about in our children are what our society drives us to do for rational evolutionary reasons, because there really isn't another choice but putting as much as you can into your children and slowing down the number of children you're having. So we're now entering into this demographic collapse, but we have avoided a Malthusian disaster. So we have not poisoned our world. We have not used up all of our resources, and we're not going to. Now, we're still having problems with global warming. This is a Malthusian crisis.
Is climate change not having poisoned our...
Climate change absolutely is. The population of the world is still going up. But the places where we are rapidly reducing our population growth are the places that produce the most carbon. And so we are actually transitioning faster than we expected to to a carbon neutral, at least transportation world. The developed world is getting rid of our gas cars much faster than we thought we were going to. And we're actually really getting to some of our carbon goals in terms of just burning fossil fuels for transportation. Unfortunately, this is not happening in our factories quite as fast. Things like cement and aluminum are just tremendously energy expensive, and there's not a lot of ways around that. And because the way capitalism is designed to have constant growth, we've actually programmed in constant growth even when we have a flat to declining population. And so this sort of cultural resource squandering, I guess is one way to think about it, is going to be driving the increase in carbon use for some time. But overall, as a planet, we now have some breathing room because we've lowered our reproductive rate. And this is entirely based on education of women. By having women in high school and in university, they are not having babies. Because when you're in a class, you're not having babies. I mean, some of my students are. I've had students raise their hand and say, I'm pregnant right now. But it's very rare. Most of my students are nodding. Most of my students are female. This is something we can talk about at a later time, that men are not going to college the same way women are.
Okay, that's new and interesting to me.
Later thing.
On,
later thing. So yeah, most of my students are female. Most of them are in their 20s or late teens, early 20s, and they are not having babies, and this is prime reproductive times. And so I'm looking at whole cohorts of women who are not reproducing, and this is absolutely what is driving the collapse in reproduction in the developed world. And I think overall this is a good thing. It will cause problems for us economically, and we need to start thinking about how we can have an economics not based on maximum production growing all the time with a constant, winnowing of slots, longer lines, fewer seats on the airplane, all of these kinds of things. And so we need to figure that out, but that's a separate issue. These women are not having babies. It's going to save the world, and it's directly about educating women. And so I ask my classes, think about your grandparents. How many babies did they have? Think about your parents. When did they have their first babies? And then think about you. How old are you now? When are you planning to have kids? And so in my parents' generation, a lot of the people were having babies at in the age of 20, 25, in that range. Their parents might have been even younger, not everyone, but and they would have had 5 or 6 kids.
It's fascinating because you're talking about having these conversations with your students now in the United States. When I was in Korea in the mid 90s teaching high school students, they were already telling me that they were planning on going to school. They were going to go to college and not going to have children until later. And now, 30 years later, you're telling me that they've dropped below 1.
Yes, they're less than half of their population in the next generation.
This is
it's tremendous, and it's going to save the world, but we're also in for a big issue.
The economy is going to take a tremendous hit.
Hit.
Make what we need to make. We can't do
right.
what we need to do.
So we need to have the people in, let's say, Africa, who are actually at high reproductive rates, come to our countries and help us produce things.
That would be great.
It would be great. I don't see a lot of history in Europe or America of welcoming people from Africa.
Yeah.
But Ghana right now has a reproductive rate of 4, whereas Korea has it 0.8. So you can see where the people in the world are going to be coming from, and we have not prepared for this in any way. Again, a separate issue.
Yeah.
But I wanted to point out that this education of women is brand new. It has happened in the last generation. We can see it happening in real time. So people who are still alive have had grandkids where they have 5 or 6 grandkids, and they're looking at their grandkids, and their grandkids are having 1 or 2 at most. And so this is an intergenerational change that is happening in real time right now. The last 100 years have been tremendous. The last 50 years have been tremendous. So I've had 2 students talking about their grandmothers who had their mothers when they were 12. One was a indigenous woman in Colombia. Another one was a Pashtun in Afghanistan. And their mothers had them when they were something like 18 or 19. And so here they are in graduate school at the age of 21, 22, no babies, with a 50-year-old grandmother saying, "Where's the babies? I want my great-grandchildren." And they're so proud of themselves to be succeeding and to be in college, and they know they're not having babies early, and this is absolutely a conscious choice. And they're having there's a generational split between them and their grandmothers, who don't understand why they don't have 6 babies already. And this is something that is happening right now, and I think that's sort of an extreme version of it, but we see it in, say, the conflicts with the baby boomers talking to us all about how we're raising our children wrong and we're spoiling them. And they think we're doing a terrible job because we're spending all of our resources to raise our children and to keep them safe. And they think that this is going to make us weaker as a species.
Softer, yeah.
Softer. Yeah. What they don't understand is that we're looking at an evolutionary change that is happening really rapidly, and it's because of the way the world has changed. We're not on farms anymore. We're not working in factories even anymore. We are working in cubicles, and to be a cubicle worker, you're a knowledge worker, and that knowledge worker is based on a very limited number of paths for success, often through universities. And the best way to do really well is to have a lot of resources from an early age, so you can get into that grammar school you need to get into, so you can get into the right high school, so you can get into the right college, so you can get a job that will give you the resources, so that by the time you're, say, in your mid-30s, you might have enough resources to have a child.
You are describing deeply baked in class divisions
deeply baked in class divisions, and the sort of the way out of these things is to have all of what I've been talking about: 2-parent households working towards a university success. And what do we see in areas of say the United States, where family dynamics are collapsing, is we see a lot of issues, and so there's a lot of rural areas that are no longer farmers. And they're no longer miners, and there's not a lot of other industries there for them, and they end up with single-parent families. They have fewer options. It's a lot harder to go to university from a situation like that. And this has been understood for a long time as, oh no, poor people reproduce too fast. So the Victorians were worried. They thought that all of these people moving into the city were going to make what they called the marching morons, to use a really un-PC phrase, that poor people reproduce too fast, and they were going to, in our meritocracy, they were going to swamp the meritocracy with too many idiots. So there's the Idiocracy movie, where only the poor people are having large families and smart people are having small families. But this is flatly not true. We have not had enough time to evolve actual intelligence differences between classes. We do not actually live in a meritocracy. A lot of the people who succeed, yeah, they're often smart, but they've also had all of these resources given to them from an early age.
They've had advantages.
And so all of these things have given them what they needed to have to succeed from birth. If you don't get that, it's a lot harder to succeed. It doesn't mean you're stupid. So this is no longer anything to do with genes, nothing to do with hereditable factors. This is just a societal one. So it's very much, did you win the lottery at birth, or did you lose the lottery at birth?
And the other thing that speaks to is that it could very well be fixed. Like these
are things that can be fixed. Absolutely. If we thought about another way to do our society. And it seems as though, because we're in this transition period, we might be moving into a world where we could start to fix this, where we could start to look at ways to have resources spread a little bit more egalitarian through our society.
Let's not start talking about politics.
No, I don't want to talk about politics at all.
Boy.
But these things, as I was mentioning, that the tension and competition is built into the way we work as a capitalist system.
Yes.
I'm not saying that capitalism isn't a great way of producing resources. It has produced more resources than any other system out there, but it tends to not be really good at dividing those resources equally. And so just like a silverback gorilla gets all of the mating opportunities, and unless you're the biggest gorilla, you get 0 mating opportunities, we've worked ourselves into a sort of winner-take-all society, which is extremely stressful for all of us, and where we are forced to put extra resources into our offspring in the hope that they will become that silverback
So how
gorilla.
will spoiling our kids save the world? I see how educating women will save the world. But...
Well, essentially, this is all part of the same thing, is that all of these resources that we're putting into our children is part of a process of having them reproduce later. We're keeping them in school longer. We're not having them have babies at the age of 15 or 16. They're waiting until their 30s, so they're twice as long to reproductive age.
So you're saying this isn't something that we should have a judgment on. This is an evolutionary change happening in front of our eyes.
It's happening in front of our eyes, and we keep arguing against it and say we shouldn't spoil our children. We need to figure out how to have maybe more babies because we're looking at a at a demographic collapse. At the same time, how are we going to do with a world with sort of limited resources and allocating these resources? And we really haven't, as a society, realized that these are all part of a single thing that's happening for essentially evolutionary reasons that are where we value our reproductive choices. We like not having more babies. We like not having more babies because it allows us to give more attention to our babies, which we enjoy, right? Evolution tends to reward things that give you evolutionary success. And so we will automatically give all our time and energy and all of our let's keeping our baby safe energy into our very few babies that we now have.
So you're saying go ahead, spoil that child and enjoy it.
A little bit of that, and also, let yourself off the hook. This has been a sort of theme I've been trying to work on, is that a lot of things that are programmed into us, we then feel guilty about.
Yes.
And I'm saying don't feel guilty about what you have no choices about. If you are over programming your child's childhood, and you're wondering, because they're doing so much Little League, are they having a real childhood? You don't have a lot of choice in that. They won't get into the right high school unless you do that. They will. If I don't sign up my daughter for fencing, that would have been a problem for her getting into a university. So she needs all of these things. Yeah. So anyway, this is, I guess, part of my overall project to say a lot of what we're programmed to do, we then feel guilty about, and we need to start thinking about letting ourselves off the hook to a certain extent, and not yelling at each other for doing things wrong. Just like I try and let previous generations off the hook to a certain extent for their negligence. This is how they were raised because it worked well. It worked well for them, and it had worked well for the last 10,000 years. And so we really are seeing a significant change in the way we live right now. It's not our imagination.
Fascinating.
All right, so that's why I want to leave it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Josh.